A few weeks ago, I had the chance to be interviewed by my friend Joel Sedekase over at the Think Institute. And the topic of the interview was generally the question of, well, the relationship between science and faith. And one thing that I noticed about that interview is it provides a lot of opportunities to sort of zero in on some specific topics, some challenges, some questions, some concerns that we as Christians should have or encounter when thinking about the relationship between science and faith. And the reason I wanted to sort of isolate the series of clips that we have here in this video is because it comes in the context of responding to an atheist challenging us that miracles are really just as silly as magic. And what you'll find is a great exchange between myself and Joel that I think sheds some light on how to understand and respond to this type of challenge. I kind of chuckle at that because obviously the relationship between the miraculous and magic is meant to be silly, right? It's meant to be this sort of farcical attempt at, I wouldn't say mocking us, but really that's what it is, right? They're assuming magic is fictitious. Magic is just something you see a magician do a trick, but really there's no such thing as magic.
Right.
So if they're going to make this comparison, then what they are saying in effect is that the miraculous is impossible. But what does that actually mean? Well, if you're going to say the miraculous is impossible, at a minimum, you have to say that God does not exist. So any of those people who consider themselves to be weak atheists, who say that, oh, I don't say that God doesn't exist, I just say I'm not convinced that God does exist, this sort of comparison is off the table. Because in order to make the comparison, you have to say that the miraculous is fictitious, or it's like something that we know to be fictitious. So God must be fictitious in order for that analogy to hold. And even if God does exist, then they'd have to go ahead, even if they say, well, maybe God exists, but God wouldn't interact with the universe, they'd have to argue that, or they'd have to argue that it would be some sort of impossibility of him interacting. There are all sorts of these burdens that the atheist just cannot bear if they want to go ahead and say the miraculous is impossible. And that's effectively what this sort of argument is.
The way I've heard it compared is this, and the credit goes to Doug Wilson on this. It's like, if you, try, we say we don't believe in magic, but we believe in miracles. But then you read the Gospels. Try explaining to your 6-year-old that Jesus turning water into wine is not magic. That's pretty magical. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like Jesus feeding 5,000 people. So it's like, well, if you want to call it magic, okay, that just means that God can do magic. But that's just another word for miracle. If we're saying magic is absurd and impossible, like you just said, well, no, God's not absurd. God's not impossible. But if all we're saying is that the creator of the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry and biology, can suspend those laws when he chooses to for his own purposes, well, you can call that miracles, magic, or whatever you want to call it. It's just God doing that. The Bible calls them signs and wonders.
Right.
So it all depends on how you define things. So
right.
I kind of like the idea that, yeah, Jesus did magic, but it was real magic. And it's,
right.
we call them miracles, we call them signs and wonders. But one thing we can't call them is impossible if God exists. So everything really does hinge on that, right?
And another route you could take is simply say, okay, well, have you interacted with the work of someone like Craig Keener, who has a 2-volume set of cataloging miracle accounts, modern day miracle accounts, and they're with various degrees of attestation. But I mean, to say that this assumption that the miraculous is sort of unanimously considered to be absurd, well, that's not actually true when you actually look at how common claims to the miraculous are. Now, those may not be true claims in every case, but you can't start from this basis that it is absurd. But even on just the process of the miraculous, I have to throw this out there because it's a book I read earlier this year. It's called Divine Action, Determinism, and the Laws of Nature. It's by Jeffrey Koperski, and it is one of the most phenomenal reads I've ever read. If you want to buy the hardcover version, it's like $155, but it might still be free on Kindle. So there's that.
Oh, wow.
That's how I read it.
That's
but
great.
he actually goes through this. It's super rich, super philosophical, and super scientific. So,
Tell us the name of that book one more time.
Divine Action, Determinism, and the Laws of Nature. I hope that exchange was helpful to you in understanding how to respond to this sort of challenge where someone says that the miraculous is just as absurd as magic. But if you want to dig deeper, I encourage you to check out the 2 links in the description to Craig Keener's works on miracles and Jeffrey Koperski's work on divine action, determinism, and the laws of nature. But in addition to that, you can go to the Think Institute via the link in the description to watch the full interview that I had with Joel. And while you're there, be sure to subscribe to the Think Institute, in addition to making sure you've subscribed here at Catalyzing Faith.